Welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello, and welcome to the 8th episode of Punishment and Profit, an educational webinar series about the prison industry presented by Worth Rises and the Green Space. I'm Bianca Tyler, founder and executive director at Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of those it touches. Today, we're talking about financial services in the prison industry, or how money moves in and out of prisons and jails. Before we get into tonight's program, let's learn 5 quick facts about the sector to ground us.
What's a reasonable fee to send money to a loved one? How about 40%? My name is Bianca Tyler. I'm the executive director at Worth Rises, and here are 5 facts you should know about financial services in the prison industry. In 1930, the federal prison system banned families from bringing food and essential items into facilities and established trust accounts for incarcerated people to force money transfers and garnish abusive fines and fees. The families of incarcerated people transfer an estimated $1.8 billion into prisons and jails to support their loved ones each year, and pay as much as 50% in transfer fees. When people are released from prison or jail, they are increasingly given their account balance on prepaid debit cards that are laden with predatory fees. These debit card providers rely on the rapid churn of people through jails, which depends on arresting people for low-level offenses. There are millions of people on probation and parole making monthly supervision payments. A single missed payment can land someone back behind bars. Learn more with the curriculum at worthrises.org.
A little later in the show, we'll be talking to Katie Rose Quandt and Paul Wright. But first, I'd like to introduce Ebony Underwood. Ebony is the founder and CEO of We Got Us Now, a national nonprofit organization at the helm of a movement led by those impacted by parental incarceration, working to engage, educate, elevate, and empower this historically invisible population. For years, Ebony fought for the release of her father, who was serving a life without parole sentence handed down as part of the war on drugs. After 33 years in federal prison and surviving COVID-19 inside, William Underwood, Ebony's father, was recently granted compassionate release and released from prison in January. Ebony, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, Eb, I just want to congratulate you on winning a harrowing battle against the system to bring your father home. How are you? How's your family? How's your father doing since his release?
Wow, thank you so much. Oh my God, it's been an incredible 2021 has been the year for us. I mean, I'm sure just after the pandemic, my father suffered from COVID. So we were up in arms and just hysterical about what would happen to him because he's in federal prison, and we just don't know. We didn't know, but thankfully we had an opportunity to get back into court, and he is home now. He was released on Martin Luther King's birthday. So what better way to celebrate freedom and civil humanity than on that day? And so, yeah, it's been great. He's adjusting well. My family, my siblings and I are ecstatic that he's home. I mean, this is, again, it's just a blessing. So thank you so much for asking. I appreciate that.
Of course, and I'll say you did have quite an incredible welcome home party for him with Senator Booker. How'd that go?
Oh my God. So Senator Booker was somebody that I reached out in the process of over the last 7 years. I've been advocating publicly to get my dad home. And Senator Booker was someone that I reached out to, and he was just so kind and really believed in my story and took the time to get to know my dad and meet him. So he had thought he would come out through the Obama administration, but God had other plans, and he came out this way through a judge, which was through the First Look and the First Step Act. And so the first thing that we wanted to do was to have a conversation between my dad and Senator Booker. And Senator Booker was like, yeah, let's do a fireside chat. So we did a fireside chat with my dad and Senator Booker. And you can find that on underwoodlegacyfund.com.
That's amazing. Again, we're so excited to see your dad home, Ebony. So jumping into today's topic, financial services. Over the last 3 decades that your father was incarcerated, your family obviously spent an incredible amount of money supporting him. He needed money for phone calls and commissary, and obviously had very limited wages that couldn't really support those things, especially him being such a involved father as he was with you and your siblings. To support him, you needed to transfer a lot of money into his trust accounts. And the simple act of transferring that money came at a grave cost. Can you tell us about that?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So I'll just speak to the last 7 years. So 7 years ago, my father was 60 years old. He had been, for most of his incarceration, thankfully, he had businesses before he was incarcerated. So for a lot of that, he was able to really support himself, thankfully. I mean, we did for most of it too, as well. But in the last 7 years, I personally have spent $300 per month. And if you calculate that in 1 year, that's $3,600. In order to send him money, I have to go through Western Union. My father's in federal prison. So was in federal prison. So because he was in federal prison, every system is different. Different states have different sentencing schemes. This is not a monolithic issue. When you think about children of incarcerated parents or having a parent incarcerated, it's not a monolithic issue. For me, having a parent in federal prison, my system was Western Union. For other people that have parents in states and jails, there's these other telecommunication companies that they have to go through. For me, it was Western Union. And the cost, which is the maximum amount of money you can spend, is $300, or you can send at a time is $300. And it costs $9.99 to send every time I would send the money. So I calculated over the last 7 years, because this is when I I said, let me just do the time since I've been advocating. Like, how much money have I actually spent? And thank you for asking this question, because in my mind, I was like, yeah, like, how much money have I actually spent? So $3,600 a year. That's not including how much it costs through Western Union, which was, I calculated it, and it's $9.99 per month. So at a year, at an annual cost, that's $119.88 per year. Now let's multiply that by 7 years. That's $839.16 in fees that I've spent in the last 7 years, notwithstanding the $3,600 I spent per year over the last 7 years, which equals $25,200 is how much money I've spent in the last 7 years. I was like, wow, I can't believe I spent this much money. And
I mean, that's how much money you sent into prisons,
right? And
I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, and I'll say, like, I mean, you raise a number of really like important points in even your like your commentary, right? Like, as you said, this is the federal system, and you are using Western Union. There's actually a lot of other companies, or not a lot, but there's a handful of other companies that, you know, some of the state systems, some of the local systems use, some of them charge even more. And there was also something important, two other, I think, important facts in what you shared, which was one, that you actually deposited the maximum amount, right?
Yes.
Because that allowed you to maximize on that fee. But the reality is, because it was a flat rate fee, you know, not everybody has $300, right?
So true. And Bianca, you know, it's funny you say that. There's been times where I've sent $900 at one time, or $600. Again, that's $9.99 for each of those times that I spend money. And if it was $60, if I wanted to send him $120, you know, still, again, it's $9.99.
Right.
10, that's like, you know, $30.
Yeah, I'm imagining, you know, people supporting their loved ones who, you know, can only get $50 at a time, right? And are sending that money in, and they're paying that $9.99, and now all of a sudden you're like, wait, that's 20% fee. That's wild. And so it's crazy. And I think the other thing you noticed, you mentioned, is you name them as telecommunications firm. Now, obviously, Western Union is not one, but the reality is that the entire field of financial services has actually been largely swallowed up by telecom companies. As you know, JPay, one of the big financial services companies in this space, is actually owned by Securus. So it's like, it's insane. I mean, in your work with We Got Us Now, you work with a lot of young people who are supporting their parents in prison. And there is something perhaps complicated about that, right? Parents depending on their children, when usually we see the opposite in our society. So can you say a little bit for us about how does that impact the parent-child relationship? And how are young people that you're working with across this country harnessing their experience with parental incarceration to create change around things like fees that they have to pay for money transfers and other costs?
Right, that's such a great question. So We Got Us Now has been building these directly impacted daughters and sons called actionists. We call them actionists. We Got Us Now actionists. And as actionists, they have taken they have harnessed their advocacy to help to reform the criminal justice system. Because what we found is that there are not a lot of our voices in these spaces. And we never feel like it's a burden to be connected to our parents. We want to stay connected to our parents. So whatever we have to do in order to stay connected to our parents, we will do so. However, and a lot of times, you know, there's all these different sentencing scheme. I'm about to say sentencing scheme. There's these predatory schemes that are happening, you know, with these companies that are charging us exorbitant fees to stay connected to our family members, just to ensure that they actually have the funds to buy soap, you know, buy basic hygiene products, and just, you know, take care of themselves, eat food. My father used to like to buy canned soup and canned tuna. But yeah, you know, the dynamic between the child and the parent is one that we all are working towards for people to understand that no matter what, it is because of the love that we have for our parents that we will fight to the end of the earth to stay connected to them. And so, we're going to continue to advocate around this. We work in collaboration, I'll say specifically in New York and Louisiana. We have some organizations that we work with, and some of our actionists, one is based in Louisiana, two are based in New York, and they've all both advocated for free phone calls along with Worth Rises and several other, some of the coalitions that we work with, along with some of the coalitions you put together, Bianca, to support this work and really, really just uplift this important piece that just feels so predatory so many times. I mean, when you think about it, it really just breaks my heart, because when you take a parent out of the home, it's already an economic disadvantage to that family. So now it's just like you're profiting off of our love. Like, why are they continuing to profit off of our love for our loved ones? It's crazy. So yeah, like the work that we do, we'll continue doing it. And the way that we do it is by working in collaboration with different organizations across the country to ensure that we're in partnership with them so that they can understand the intricate details that we have to endure in order to stay connected to our family members.
I mean, thank you so much. I mean, I think the work that you're doing, like you said, is so important because it is a population that we often don't hear from, right? We think of children as not being able to advocate for themselves so often. And in fact, there's a lot of really important things the children of people inside want to say. And we know that the majority of women and men who are, and others who are inside are in many cases parents often of children, even under the age of 18, some older, and even those youth have a lot to say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Ebony. We're gonna bring you back at the end of the show. But to keep up with Ebony's work now, please follow her. And We Got Us Now on Twitter at __got us now. A quick reminder that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to use the chat function to pose questions to any of our guests. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PunishmentProfit. Our next guest is Katie Rose Quandt. Katie Rose is a freelance journalist who writes about criminal justice, incarceration, and inequality. She is a senior editor at the Prison Policy Initiative, and she's written for Slate, Rolling Stone, and many other outlets. Katie Rose, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we just spent a lot of time talking about money transfers and how money sort of gets into prisons and jails. And now I want to pivot to another type of financial vehicle in prisons and jails these days, which is the debit release card. And this is, in fact, how money is now leaving jails. This is a much less common product that people may not be, in many cases, familiar with if you aren't familiar with those who are leaving prisons and jails these days. Can you explain what a debit release card is and what are some of the concerns that they raise?
Yeah, so when someone is released from jail or prison, they get back the money that belongs to them kind of on their way out the door. And that might be money that, like Ebony was discussing a second ago, that their loved ones and family members have transferred to them over the years of their incarceration. It might be money that they painstakingly saved up working in low-wage, 10 cents an hour prison jobs. It can also be money that was on their person when they were first arrested and booked into the system. And so all that money is owed back to someone on the day of their release. And it's very important and useful to people. This might be the only cash they have on hand as they head out the doors of the prison trying to get a bus home or buy their first meal or buy a jacket on a cold day or something like that. And historically, this money would have been given to people in the form of cash or maybe a check. But increasingly over the years, as these massive privatized prison service companies and telecom companies have found their way into all aspects of the criminal justice system, it's become increasingly common for people to get their own money back to them instead of in cash, but in the form of like a prepaid debit card. So we'll have their exact amount put on it that they can kind of spend down at ATMs or stores or restaurants. It just looks like any other debit card. And that might not sound like the end of the world, but it has some like very major inconveniences to people. First of all, there's certainly many instances where cash is just much more convenient if you are trying to leave jail and get on a city bus and go home, like, and depending on the situation, like, you might not be able to buy that bus ticket with a plastic debit card that all of your money is tied up in. So it's just, there's so many instances where it's more convenient and more versatile just to have that money in cash. And that maybe feels a little bit more like an unintended consequence of this switch over to the cards, but there's actually a much bigger and more insidious and more intentional side effect of these cards, which is that they almost always come just absolutely laden with fees. So it's very common for someone to walk out the door, get their money back on this card, and very quickly discover that pretty much anytime they try to use the card or even don't use the card, they're going to be charged these massive fees again and again and again. So, you might go check your balance at the ATM and be charged a fee for that. And then you try to take money out and you're charged a fee for that. Every single time you go to a store and try to make a purchase, there'll be a fee scooped off the top. A lot of these cards even have inactivity fees or like weekly maintenance fees. So you're being charged if you use your card to use your own money, and you're being charged even if you don't use your card. So there's just kind of countless fees just chipping away at this often small amount of money that you were even starting with in the beginning. There's one story that I had reported on that followed a lawsuit where someone had been released from prison and given this card. And first he encountered some fees, and then it went a step further. And the companies that had issued the card actually closed down his account because they said that there was suspicious activity. And so now someone's spending the very first months and weeks of their freedom, like on the phone with customer service, trying to jump through all these hoops, prove his identity, trying just desperately to get access to the money that's rightfully his. And ultimately, like, they never opened the account back up and that money was just gone. And that's an extreme example. But I think when you just hear stories like that and you see like what these fees are and how high they can be, $5 to use an ATM, $30 if you want to try to close out your account and just get your money out. Just, it's very clear that the fees are the intention. Like, this is the business model. That's the way the money is being made here.
There's so much in there that you just mentioned. I mean, I think this idea of like inactivity fees, of fees for purchasing something in a store, fees for checking your balance. But I think, even you just said this insidious fee of $30 to close an account. So somebody else opens the account for you. It has all of these fees, from maintenance fees to inactivity fees, which, essentially are just ways to make sure that no matter what, they're always going to be paid. But then to even close your account, there is an excessive fee. So really, there's almost nothing you can do with this card without incurring fees. Even wanting to get your money out of it can cost you quite a lot of money.
Exactly. And yeah, like you said, someone else chose it for you. You had no say in what this card was going to be, like the way someone on the outside could choose the card of their choosing. It's just what you're handed.
Right. It's not like when you're leaving prison, you can say, like, I'd like this Visa or this MasterCard, or I'd like my money in a check, or I'd like it in cash. You're like, no, here's the card you're going to get from some bank you've never heard of that's going to charge you for everything. So there's something interesting here, because it's unlike money transfers and the money transfer business that we spoke about with Ebony. The debit release card business is not focused on people who are in prison, but actually people who are coming out. How does this raise particular concerns?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It is sort of operating in a little bit of a different space than like the money transfers that Ebony was talking about a second ago. But I think in both cases, these companies, it's often the same companies that are operating all of these different services. In all cases, they're profiting off of just the massive scale of incarceration and the huge numbers involved. So, a few dollars in the examples of what Ebony was talking about, like a few dollars might mean a lot to an individual or an incarcerated person or a family. It means nothing to JPay until you see that they're incurring these few dollar fees 100,000 times over. And you can see how their profit model is based on these bad policies, these unfair, racist policies that keep people serving extremely long sentences, very punitive sentences for as long as possible. And their bottom line is based on keeping people behind bars, keeping them accepting these money transfers and making these calls and just incurring fees on and on and on. And you're right that these release cards are a little different because they don't even come into play until the day someone walks out the door. And on one hand, that's kind of frustrating to realize that these same companies have managed to kind of position themselves on both sides so that they profit no matter what. And, if someone stays in prison and keeps paying the transfer and phone fees, they profit. If that person is released and is handed a release card, they profit off those fees as well. And that's just a very frustrating situation to kind of see how they've positioned themselves. But even more than that, I think that it's pretty clear that these debit cards are still profiting off of this massive scale bad policy, because it's not just the releases themselves that bring in money. It's this whole system of people cycling in and out of the criminal justice system, and especially jails. These cards are given out at many prisons and many jails, but jails are seemingly really the moneymaker here. We have this massive problem of jail churn in the country, where there's like 11 million jail admissions every year. And a lot of people are being booked into jails on incredibly minor offenses, charges being dropped and someone's released the next day. Maybe the same person is being repeatedly arrested and booked and released and booked and released. And all of that serves the bottom line for these companies, because every time someone comes back out the door of the jail, it's another opportunity to convert whatever money was in their pocket into one of these fee-filled cards. So I think it's still, even though it's outside and it's in this release space, it's still benefiting from this over-policing, high levels of arrests, constantly booking people into jails. These policies are just serving the bottom line of these companies yet again.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because a lot of times I hear in the work that we do that, if you go to prison, then you get kind of what's coming to you, right? If you, commit a crime or whatever it might be. And a lot of people think about it as serious crimes and all of these things. But this particular model around debit release cards is designed to be most profitable around low-level offenses, pre-trial folks, and folks who may actually not even be charged with crimes. You can get booked into a facility, held, have your money confiscated, and 4 hours later be released.
Yeah.
And guess what? That money that was in your pocket 4 hours ago is now on a card, where they're going to essentially, you're going to lose $40 or $50 or potentially everything that you had, right? And so this notion that this particular business, and I think the CEO was even quoted of one of these companies saying that they're not interested in the prison business, people stay in prison too long. They're interested in the jail business and that 11 million people, as you say, that are admitted every single year. So I think people understanding that piece of it really is super important, that, these are actually businesses that are preying intentionally on the things that maybe everyday folks are like, people shouldn't be getting arrested for that.
Yeah, absolutely. That fact that the CEO said that is telling.
Right. So Katie Rose, you come to this work as a journalist, and I appreciate talking to journalists about the obscure aspects of the prison industry because you make a good temperature check for public awareness and reception. And in your work, you uncover a lot of atrocities and find ways to tell everyday people who may not be familiar with those atrocities about them. Now, in this space, you're a bit more knowledgeable than the standard journalist, not just because you've been doing this work for a while, but because you also have a loved one who's incarcerated. But when it came to your research and writing about financial services here, what was one thing that surprised you?
I do have a loved one in prison. My foster sister's been incarcerated for about 10 years. So over the years, I definitely have not spent as much as Ebony, but I have gotten used to, everything is more expensive. I'm not really surprised as much anymore. If I send a package from a pre-approved vendor, it's going to cost so much more than the grocery store. If I try to accept a call or send a message, there's always fees. And even despite seeing that all firsthand, and even despite reporting on all of these problems, for my career, I still do constantly find myself surprised when I learn about yet another industry and segment that these companies have sort of found their way into and inserted themselves as the middleman. And I think I definitely felt that way. I had never heard of prepaid release cards. I just didn't know about this particular segment that these companies are profiting off of until I started reporting on it. And I just found it particularly frustrating and insidious. And I think that I'm still learning about new to me ways that these companies, I think they're still expanding. They're always finding like another way to profit off the backs of incarcerated people and their families. And I also think that this particular issue, these release cards, I really find very frustrating. Like probably I shouldn't have been surprised that they exist, but they just sort of like, everyone kind of knows what it's like to encounter some company that's kind of predatory and scammy, and like you've asked them 5 times to cancel this monthly subscription you never signed up for, and they just like keep charging your account, and you feel so powerless and frustrated and like you're being stolen from. And I just think this particular industry of these prepaid debit release cards is basically just doing that times 1,000, because it's purposely targeting this population of people who are in one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives, probably. Like, we know how difficult it is to re-enter society, especially if you're coming home from prison. You're trying to maybe find employment and housing and reconnect with family and avoid parole violations. You have all these challenges and roadblocks that we know society sets up in your way. And then on top of it all, your own money is just being stolen dollar by dollar every time you try to access it. And I just find that very frustrating and infuriating. And I think I was a little bit surprised by that that really struck me when I started learning about this industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for it not to strike you, right? Like whenever you learn about, I think debit release cards is one of those examples. And, you know, I find just in my work consistently in this space that I tell a lot of people about all different types of predation, and I try to not be desensitized because there's so many that are just wild. Like you think to yourself and you're like, wait, what is happening?
Yeah. Exactly.
So with that, thank you so much for obviously all the reporting and writing that you do. And thank you for your time. And we will see you at the end of the show as well. To learn more about Katie Rose's work, follow her on Twitter at Katie Rose Quandt. We are excited now to move into our next segment. We'd like to remind everyone first, though, that you can share questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or by using the hashtag Punishment Profit on Twitter. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. So our final guest today is Paul Wright. Paul is the founder and director of the Human Rights Defense Center and the editor of Prison Legal News. He started both in 1990 while serving a 17-year sentence in Washington State. Paul is one of the leading experts on prison conditions, free speech, and government transparency in criminal justice. Paul, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show, Bianca. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much. And I will say, Paul and I have spoken for a long time about a lot of issues in the prison industry. One of my confidants in this space and thought partners. So Paul, I just want to thank you expressly for all the work that you do. And like I said, the thought partnership that you often offer. With that, I'll say that we're in for a treat because Paul knows probably more about financial services in the prison industry than I'd say probably anyone. So with that, Katie gave us a really good understanding of the debit release card business. But this is a space, as I said, you've spent a lot of time in as an advocate. But I'd love to jump into some of the work that you're doing to actually disrupt these financial services. Can you tell us a little about the corporations that dominate this space and the litigation that you have brought or are bringing against some of them?
Sure. One of the things it's important to note that as recently as 15 years ago, this debit card industry didn't even exist. It's something that's been created out of whole cloth. And I think as Ebony and Katie pointed out, it's largely these predatory corporations that have figured out how to monetize every aspect of human contact and human contact with the criminal justice system. And this debit card industry started around 15 years ago. And they basically glommed on to a reality that when people are released from jail and prison, they're typically given their money. And for literally hundreds of years, that had been either they had their cash returned to them, they were given cash, or they were given a check. And there was no fee for this. And as there shouldn't be, because simply put, this is, people are getting their own money back. And so these companies figured out that, hey, let's market ourselves to the prisons and the jails and get them to give us monopoly contracts. So they'll give us the prisoners money and then we're going to charge the prisoners fees to put it on these debit cards. And if they never activate the cards or can't get all the money off, we're just going to take that money too. And that's what they've been doing for the past 15 years. And right now, the debit card landscape is dominated by three companies. One is Numi, the other one is Rapid Financial Solutions, and the other one is JPay, which, as we mentioned earlier, is also in the money transfer business, and they're owned by Securus. So, and this is one of those things where this is an industry that didn't exist 15 years ago, but each year they're getting more and more jails and more prison systems using their products, and they do so by deploying sales teams. That's one of the ways that they do it. And, they're slowly expanding. A couple of years ago, around 5 years ago, the Human Rights Defense Center, we filed one of the first of these lawsuits against Numi in Oregon, in federal court in Oregon. Our plaintiff is a woman named Danica Brown, and she was arrested, ironically, at a police brutality protest. And she was booked into the Multnomah County Jail in Portland, and she had her money taken from her. She was released from the jail, and instead of being given back her cash, she was given a debit card by Numi. And what she found out was that she was being charged fees to get her own money back. And I think a couple of things that are worth noting is that every year, I think, as Katie mentioned, around 10 to 11 million people a year are booked into American jails. And most importantly, around 70% of those people are never actually convicted of a crime. Just because people are booked into jails doesn't mean that eventually they're going to be convicted of a crime or there's a sentence or anything like that. So you figure out of those 11 million people, around 7 or 8 million of them aren't going to be convicted of a crime. Yet they're still having their money taken. A certain percentage of those are having their money taken. They're being put on these debit cards, and they're being charged fees to access their own money.
It feels like kidnapping and then robbery and then just letting folks back out to their communities.
Well, in a lot of respects, I liken this as the fact is just remember, these are the armed agents of the state. These are armed police officers that are taking your money, and then these are the armed cops that are giving you your money back on a debit card. Your money's literally being taken from you at gunpoint, and you're being forced to use these cards at gunpoint. And the consumer, the prisoner having the arrestee having these cards foisted on them, they have no choice. As George Floyd found out, you can't really argue with the police about stuff because at the end of the day, they can and will kill you. And I think that's one of the critical things of looking at this stuff. And as an advocate, one of the things to note here, these companies don't have any consumer basis. They're not trying to sell their products or convince consumers to use their products. They're not standing at the jailhouse gate saying, hey, if you don't want cash, you can use our card and we'll charge you money for it. Their whole business model is premised upon getting the government to use its armed force to make people use their products. None of these companies market their products to the general public or trying to convince consumers to use their products. If you've got, and I think that's an important thing to note, is there's a distinction. This is not your consumer credit card company that's sending you stuff in the mail asking you to use their services. This isn't Visa or MasterCard who want your business. They don't view the people they're taking the money from as their customer. They're viewing the prisoner of the jail that gives them the monopoly contract. That's who they view their customer as giving them the right to exploit people and take their money, and who's going to use their armed force to make people use their product. So our first litigation on this has been chugging along since 2015. And a federal court in Oregon, Judge Mossman originally dismissed the case, and we appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And early last year, the appeals court unanimously reversed it and said that it was unlawful for these companies to be taking people's money. The case was sent back to the lower court, and we're proceeding with that. In Washington State, we have a case pending against Rapid Financial Solutions there, where people were arrested, they were booked into the jail, had their money taken, and again had these debit cards foisted on them. And were basically being charged fees to access their own money. And that case is currently pending in federal court right now in Tacoma. And we're currently looking for more plaintiffs. Anyone that has had their money taken from them and been given one of these fee-laden debit cards, anyone that's had their money taken from them and been put on these debit cards, people can contact me. We'd love to hear from you. We're looking to bring more of these cases to end these practices. And I think that one of the things that the only people that support this, by the way, are the debit card companies and their prison and jail collaborators and the government. No one else thinks this is a good idea. And I think if you ask,
and one of the reasons, like, why are the prison and jail collaborators in this? Like, why do they care?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of which is, in a lot of cases, it's as simple and crass as the fact that they're getting a kickback. The companies are marketing these.
This is like, now we're seeing this, right? So as you know, Paul, last week we talked about telecom, and this becomes a theme, right? Which is that these corporations that are exploiting people, one of the reasons they're being allowed to exploit people who are incarcerated and their families and loved ones is because they pay off the prisons and jails to essentially do so. They share that revenue. And so when people wonder, why is it that, this is happening? Like, why would they be allowed in? It's because there's something in it for them too.
And there's the legal bribery in the form of the so-called commissions that go to the government. And there's also, this industry is also rife with criminal bribery as well. As we sit here on this webinar, Charles Epps, the director of the Mississippi Department of Corrections, is sitting in federal prison for taking millions of dollars in bribes from these same companies. He was taking $10,000 a month in a brown paper bag every month from Global Tel-Link in exchange for the monopoly prison contract for the phone system in Mississippi. At the same time, the company was paying kickbacks to the state of Mississippi. So this is an industry that's rife with corruption at every level. And again, they view the prisons and the jails who give them these monopoly contracts as their customer, not the people whose money they're actually taking. And we have the kickbacks that are being given in exchange for these monopoly contracts. And and one of the things they try to tell them too is like, you give us, you let us take the money and give them debit cards. We'll give you a kickback, and it's going to save you the hassle of handling the money. But part of the thing to remember is that, when we have a government that runs a police state, if they're going to lock up 2.5 million people a year and they're going to arrest and cage 10 million people a year, there's some infrastructure, some logistics that go along with it. And that's one of the things that they keep trying to farm out. But it's not just the farming out. There's also these predatory companies that are just looking at this as a money-making opportunity to continue gouging poor people and profiting off of the American police state.
Well, and let's talk about that infrastructure, because I want to now flip to one more major category of financial services. We've now covered money transfers and we've covered debit release cards. But there's one we haven't talked about, which is probation and parole payment processing. And as you said, there's a massive infrastructure. There's over 4.5 million people on probation or parole on any given day. And many of these folks are expected to pay supervision fees. So can you help explain what is this probation parole payment processing business? And how is it making it harder for people out of prison and jail to stay out of prison and jail?
Sure. I mean, this is also kind of perverse. This gets back into the ongoing theme that I think we've seen on the series so far, which is formerly free government services are now being charged for, and the poor people under these enmeshed in the police state are being forced to pay and pay and pay. And again, we're talking about JPay, the names that keep coming up a lot. So the number one processor of these parole and probation fees is, you guessed it, JPay. And so, for example, here in Florida, people on parole or probation are forced to pay anywhere from $110 to around $220 a month for the privilege of being on parole or probation. And some of the people I've talked to here in Florida, they can only pay through JPay. And then JPay charges them a fee to take the money on behalf of the state of Florida. And then they break up, and then they charge a certain fee based on the dollar amount, and then they don't allow the fee to be paid off all at once. They force people to pay it in multiple installments to maximize the amount of money that they're going to be charged. And so this is an ongoing issue as well.
Paul, can we just understand that? How much is the fee in Florida to be on parole?
I've seen it vary. Some of it depends on the county. Some of it depends on who the probation or parole agency is. Is it the state or is it the county? I've seen the state of Florida charging up to $110 a month. Some counties I've seen charging up to $180, $200 a month.
And so when they charge those, JPay only allows you to pay how much at a time? $100. So if the fee is $120 and JPay only allows you to pay $100 at a time. Now, mind you, they contracted with this agency, so they knew what the fee was. It wasn't like they didn't know that the fee was going to be above their minimum, or their maximum rather.
Right.
And so they're charging in this way, and then they collect a flat fee for each part, and they're making people do that in multiple transactions.
Correct, and they do this to maximize the amount of money that they collect. And I think one of the things that's worth noting is just from a consumer perspective, the fact is when we're talking about money transfers, when we're talking about debit cards and that, no one else outside of prison and dealing with these predatory companies is paying this money. You can send money for free for no charge using Zelle with banks, using JPay, Chime. There's those whole myriad services, financial services that do not charge you to use their services. Yet this is one of the things that these companies, again, they do not deal with the consumer market. The only people they deal with are people they can exploit at gunpoint through these monopoly contracts. And again, this is one of those things, for example, I don't want to get into the phone rates thing, but who's paying 25 cents a minute to use the phone, in America or anywhere in the world? No one. And you've got these artificial, basically what were free services. You now have companies that have set up these literally toll booths on what was the free government road, and where they're just there to just make money off the people because they can. And and I think like Ebony was saying about being charged X amount of money to send money to her father. And then they put a low cap on how much money can be sent to maximize the fee. And I think that's the critical thing. None of these fees have anything to do with the cost of the services. They are not competing with anyone. There is no competition. And they don't view the people paying the money as their customer. All it's designed to do is gouge every last penny they can out of the prisoners, their families, and the people enmeshed in the criminal justice system.
So, Paul, in just the last 60 seconds here we have in this segment, what can we do to reverse this tide? Like, you've made it very, very clear that, this is pretty new. Like, this hasn't been the case for a long time. These used to be free services, and they don't even feel like services, right? What is handing somebody back their money? Can you even claim that to be a service? It's a simple act. So with all these moving into privatized hands, how do we reverse this?
Well,
we got to keep it short because we got to move into the next portion.
The debit cards are easy. I think this can be sued and resolved through litigation. For all this other stuff, we need to demand better of the government. The government has to stop seeing poor people and their families as profit centers to be exploited and gouged. And if they want to have an American police state, they need to make rich people pay for the police state and not pay for on the backs of the poor people being policed.
Thank you, Paul, so much. Thank you always for your work. And to follow Paul's work, visit humanrightsdefensecenter.org. If you haven't yet, now's the time to drop your questions into the chat on YouTube and Facebook or on Twitter using the hashtag #punishmentprofit. But before we jump into Q&A, here are my takeaways from this week's discussion about financial services. There's a wild irony in the idea that corporations can charge excessive fees on moving money in and out of prisons. And that's that money is actually contraband in prisons and jails. Incarcerated people cannot handle bills or coins without punishment. So their money is confiscated and held hostage, and then they are taxed for it quite a bit. Yesterday, during our regular weekly preview of Punishment and Profit on the Brian Lehrer Show, we had 4 guests in the span of just 20 minutes call with frustrations about fees related to financial services in prisons. And all of them had a different relationship with the system. There was a volunteer who was frustrated by the $6 fee she had to pay to transfer just $100 so that her incarcerated pen pal in New York could buy art supplies. There was a formerly incarcerated man who talked about his experience in Pennsylvania when the facility switched from processing money orders sent by mail for free to JPay's online system, which came at a significant cost. But beyond the cost, he raised other important points, like the fact that not everyone has access to the internet or has a credit card, like his grandmother. There was a call from someone currently incarcerated in New York City who explained how quickly the system confiscated his money on the way in, but how difficult it is to get that money back when you leave. And finally, there was a caller from Connecticut whose story deviates a bit from our topic today, but was nevertheless powerful. She shared the awful news of her husband's suicide and how she received a bill from the state making a claim for $9,000 against his estate to pay for his incarceration. In less than 20 minutes, the stories of financial abuse mounted quickly, and all of them through the criminal legal system. See, technology is not our savior. When it comes to prisons and jails, technology often actually makes things harder and more expensive, contrary to what it does for us in the broader society. Once upon a time, you could just mail a check to the prison and it'd be deposited for your loved one. Now you have to go online to have a corporation like JPay nickel and dime you, whose business model is actually shaped around preying on those with the least. Fees are the highest for the lowest deposit. And if you want to avoid those fees by still mailing in a check, if your state allows it, you'll now have to mail it to the company. You'll need to include a deposit slip. That's often impossible to find anywhere. And if you fill it out wrong, they'll send it back. In fact, even if you fill it out right, they might send it back. We actually had families try that, mailing back return slips just to see them accepted the second time. And on top of all that, they have a policy of holding checks for 10 days after receiving them. And all of this is to strong arm people into using their predatory online services. We faced this threat in New York back in 2019 when the state contracted with, yes, JPay. We organized and forced a renegotiation of rates. The online money transfer fees fell between 2 and 40%, depending on the amount deposited, and yet rates remain as high as 16% for a $20 deposit. So we also demanded that the free mail-in deposit slip be posted in every visit room and conspicuously online. And for a period, we even had to serve as a watchdog, raising complaints from families to the Department of Corrections and the corporation. But the predation is vast and we can't be everywhere. We must start to see changes in policies that protect old school financial services and ensure technology is introduced in non-exploitative ways. In closing, have you ever returned something to a store and been asked to wait 30 days for the money to be credited back to your account? Perhaps you thought, funny how it takes them seconds to take it, but a month to put it back. Well, count your blessings that they ever did. Now let's bring back all of our guests to answer some of your questions. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to jump into our doc, and I'm seeing questions coming in from YouTube. So this question actually is endearing. And at the same time, I'm going to pass this question actually really to anyone, but Paul, I know you're going to want to jump in. This question is from Ade to Sega, and it's regarding debit release cards. And the question is, how is this legal? Please explain.
Well, like a lot of things, it's legal until a judge somewhere says it isn't. And we haven't quite gotten there yet. But basically, I think that's one of the things that's happened is You have companies and corporations and banks that are figuring out new ways to rob and fleece people and exploit people that the law quite hasn't caught up with it yet. And I think this is one of those areas where I think we have a chance of resolving it through litigation and getting people all or some of their money back. But we're still a ways away from there. And of course, the court system moves slowly. And that's why we're looking for more people who are willing to help us stop this, people that are the victims of these practices, that be willing to step up to the plate so we can sue these companies to get people their money back and to stop these practices. But yeah, that is one of the questions. How is this legal? That's a very good question. And I think, like Ralph Nader likes to say, the outrage of America isn't the things that are illegal, it's the things that are legal. And for now, this is one of the things that's legal.
Ebony, Katie, Rose, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that either from a personal perspective and just, what that feels like to know that these things are legal and can happen.
I would just say, Bianca, Paul is a gem. Like, the data and the insight that he has is just like the woman said, like, how is this legal? Oh my God, it's absolutely legal. It happens all the time. People would have no idea how we are preyed upon just to stay connected to our families. It is so, and this is only just, this is just the system of profiting, right? Through commissary or sending money. All the other ways in which we try to stay connected. There's so many, and you've touched upon this. Thank you so much for this curriculum. It's really, really powerful and really informative and necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ebony. And I'm just going to echo. I think I kind of chuckled when I saw this question because it reminded me a lot of my dad. My dad asks me that question almost anytime I tell him about some scam that's happening in prison. He's just like, I don't understand, how is this legal? And I think my constant response is, well, it's not illegal. And unfortunately, that's how most of our law is written. So with that, we'll jump to another question. So this is from Mary Newsom, and I think between Katie, Rose, and maybe Paul, you'll want to look into this question, which is, have any of these companies been fined for issuing kickbacks?
No, then that's the problem, is that the kickbacks themselves are legal to the government. And the amazing thing is that when these vendors have been caught giving criminal bribes to prison officials, the prison officials go to prison, but the companies that give them the bribes, not only do they not get prosecuted, they keep the contracts they paid the criminal bribes to get. That's happened repeatedly in Florida and Mississippi and other states where, there's no dispute that, they paid criminal bribes in addition to the kickbacks they gave to the government in the state to get the contracts, and the companies don't get prosecuted, and they still keep the contracts they paid the criminal bribes to get.
And if I could build on that, I'll actually say the Mississippi example is great for what you're talking about, Paul, right? Because there's like new news even in the most recent few months, which is that not only did, as Paul, you mentioned, Chris Epps go to prison, who was the former commissioner of the DOC of Mississippi, for taking bribes from a major telecom company, which we should say GTL, the telecom company that he took bribes from, doesn't just do telephone service, actually also does financial services through TouchPay and tablets and all of those other things. Not only did he go to prison and GTL retain their contract with the Mississippi DOC, but then the new commissioner, who was in place for a few years, 3 months after she stepped down from being commissioner, actually went to work for GTL and is now being investigated once again for fraud of stealing taxpayer money. And still, the company has the contract.
And remember, their only customers are government agencies. These people do not provide services to consumers. They're not competing in the open marketplace for actual business. All they're doing is sucking up to the government by illegal or legal means to get those monopoly contracts to extort and exploit prisoners and their families. That's their whole business existence.
So the next question, I think it's a short question, is what happens, this is from Allison, what happens if somebody doesn't have cash when they are booked, and instead they have debit cards or credit cards, or I guess any other belongings? What happens to those items?
Generally, the jails have a legal obligation to hold on to people's personal belongings and to give them back to them when they're released from jail. So typically they're put into either a plastic bag or in some case a paper sack and put in an evidence room or in a property room, and then they're given to people when they're released. And this is actually what, for centuries, this is what was been done in American jails, is with cash as well. Is if you're booked and you say you had $100 in cash, they took your property, they took your clothes, your watch, whatever, and they put it into a bag. And then when you were released, whether you were being released from the jail, transferred to prison, whatever, they gave you the bag with all your property in it, including your cash. And I think this is an important thing to note, though, is that, this is the equivalent that if, say, for example, someone gets arrested, they get booked into the jail, and they've got their wedding ring and their watch, and the jail says, well, I'm going to give it to Joe's pawn shop down the street, and when you get out of the jail, you need to go see Joe and pay him some money if you want to get your wedding ring and your watch back. People would say, wow, that sounds pretty wrong. But that's the thing. There's no real distinction between your cash and your wallet and your watch. The difference is you don't have a predatory company like JPay and Numi wanting your watch and your wedding ring. They just want your cash. So that's what gets taken.
Thank you so much, Paul. And so with that, we are out of time. Thank you to all those who asked questions. And I want to say thank you so much to our guests for joining us tonight, Ebony, Katie Rose, and Paul. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us. We'll be back next week at the same time, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, to talk about food and commissary. For those who want to keep tonight's conversation going, to ask more questions or share your reflections, please join me and some of our speakers today as we head over to Clubhouse for our public study group. Follow me at Bianca Tyler to find the room. If you'd like to learn more about our work at Worth Rises or show your support, please check us out at worthrises.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Worth Rises. I'm Bianca Tyler. Good night.